Bethany Hart had not come to this secluded stretch of land by accident, nor had she chosen it simply because it was affordable or picturesque. For years she had lived in the constant thrum of city life, working long hours as a sound designer for advertising agencies, listening to the same mechanical voices of executives telling her that art was only valuable when it sold products, and dreaming of a place where silence was not manufactured in a studio but existed naturally. When her grandfather passed away, leaving her a modest inheritance, she did not squander it on travel or fleeting pleasures but instead searched for something permanent, something she could shape with her own hands. After months of research, she came across a parcel of land offered through an environmental foundation that was divesting its holdings in rural areas. The foundation had acquired it decades ago to protect a fragment of woodland from development. But as policies shifted, they began selling some parcels to individuals under the condition that construction would be minimal and respectful of the natural surroundings. The contract was thorough, the documents clear, and the boundaries officially registered with the county. Bethany visited the land for the first time on a gray November morning, when the air smelled of wet leaves and pine resin, and she felt immediately that the silence here was not emptiness, but a living presence, as though the forest itself were a companion waiting for her arrival. She spent months arranging permits, contacting modular home companies, and budgeting every cent of her savings, because she knew that once she moved here, there would be no fallback plan, no cushion to save her if something went wrong. Yet when the truck finally arrived with the prefabricated structure that would become her home, she felt no fear, only the calm certainty that she had made the right decision. The first nights were both unsettling and exhilarating. The creak of trees in the wind replaced the hum of traffic. The cry of owls filled the space that had once belonged to sirens, and she learned to fall asleep without headphones masking the outside world. She told herself she would work remotely, continue taking contracts that allowed her to survive, and gradually transform the house and the land into a place where she could finally breathe. At the edge of the property stood remnants of an old footpath, barely visible under layers of moss and bramble, which the foundation had assured her was not an official right-of-way, but a historic hiking trail that had long since fallen into disuse. They promised to update maps and redirect any lingering references so that no one could claim access through her land. She trusted them, because the paperwork was precise, and the foundation had been reputable for decades. When spring came, Bethany began to build a modest life around the house, planting small herb gardens in pots near the porch, installing solar panels, and marking the property line with a simple wooden fence more symbolic than defensive. She did not seek confrontation with anyone, nor did she expect neighbors to appear uninvited, because the nearest house was far enough to require a drive along a narrow gravel road that twisted like a snake through the trees. She had seen that house once, on the day she moved in, a sprawling construction of glass and stone that looked more like a corporate retreat than a residence. Someone wealthy lived there, clearly, but she assumed their world would never overlap with hers. For a while, she was right. Days flowed quietly, punctuated only by the rhythm of work and the rituals of solitude. She recorded the sound of rain on the roof for her projects, edited commercial tracks from her small studio, and often wandered the property line with her camera, capturing how the light shifted through the branches. Her sense of ownership was not just legal, it was visceral. The soil beneath her feet belonged to her, the walls around her sheltered her, and the silence finally answered her need for space. It was early summer when the illusion of peace began to crack. At first, it was only a letter, tucked into her mailbox without a return address, printed on official county stationery but strangely generic in tone. It claimed that she was in violation of a local ordinance for blocking access to a public right-of-way and that a fine of $200,000 was being imposed unless she restored passage immediately. Bethany laughed aloud when she first read it, convinced it had to be some bureaucratic error. $200,000 was more than the value of the entire property, and there was no road here, only her modest fence and the old disused path that had been marked irrelevant in all her documents. She drove to the county office the next morning, letter in hand, but the clerk at the desk shrugged as if this were routine. "If you received it, then it's in the system," he said, offering no further explanation. He advised her to contact the planning division, though he warned her that such cases could be complicated. As she walked out of the building, clutching the letter, Bethany realized for the first time that the silence of the forest could be fragile. It took only one accusation, one mistake to turn her refuge into a battlefield. When Bethany decided to confront the strange find, she expected at most a tangle of bureaucratic confusion, perhaps some outdated records that would need correction, but she did not expect the quiet, deliberate resistance that met her at every step. After the first visit to the county office, she tried calling the planning division, waiting through endless recorded menus, only to be transferred from one department to another until the line finally disconnected as if by design. When she did reach a human voice, the woman on the phone read mechanically from a script, insisting that the fine had been issued in accordance with county guidelines and that Bethany could either pay or appeal through a formal hearing, which would take at least 6 months to schedule. Her attempts to explain that there was no road to block, that she had legal documents proving her property boundaries, were met with silence followed by the same repeated phrases. She hung up with her pulse pounding, wondering whether the letter had been a mistake or the first sign of something more deliberate. The answer came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, while she was outside adjusting the solar panels, a black SUV rolled up the gravel road and stopped by her gate. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed not in official uniform but in the casual elegance of someone accustomed to authority. Pressed shirt, polished boots, a watch that gleamed in the sunlight. He introduced himself without hesitation, his voice steady and confident. "Drake Mallon, your neighbor down the road." His smile was controlled, not warm, and when he glanced around her property his eyes lingered on the modest fence as if it amused him. Without being invited, he leaned against the gate and said that he had heard about the letter she received. Bethany was immediately wary. How could he possibly know? She tried to keep her tone neutral, asking why this concerned him, and he laughed softly, telling her that the road she had blocked was not just any path but an old access route that connected his property to the main highway long before the land was subdivided. According to him, her fence cut directly across what had once been the only reliable way in and out, and by erecting it she had triggered a dormant clause that allowed the county to enforce penalties. Bethany struggled to keep her composure, reminding him that she had purchased the land through an environmental foundation with all boundaries registered, and that the so-called road did not exist in any official document she had seen. Drake shrugged, as if paperwork were irrelevant in the face of history, and told her that maps could be misleading, but the earth itself never lied. He gestured toward the line of trees where the faint indentation of the old footpath still ran, declaring that such traces proved the legitimacy of his claim. She answered firmly that whatever history lay beneath the soil, the law recognized only recorded property lines, and she would not be bullied into giving up part of her land. His expression hardened, though his smile remained fixed, and he told her in a quiet voice that there were easier ways to resolve disputes than dragging them through endless bureaucracy. If she removed the fence and acknowledged the right of the passage, he said, the fine would be reconsidered and no further action would be necessary. The implication was clear, but Bethany refused to agree. She ended the conversation by retreating into the house, leaving him at the gate until he finally returned to his SUV and drove away without another word. That night she sat at her desk surrounded by the folders of documents she had kept meticulously. The deed, the survey, the maps, the correspondence with the foundation. She read through them again and again, searching for any ambiguity that could be twisted against her, but everything was consistent. The property was hers, free of easements, and the path mentioned by Drake was irrelevant to modern boundaries. Yet the fact that the county had issued such a severe fine suggested that someone had supplied them with different information, and the realization that her neighbor had both motive and influence left her unsettled. Within a week, the pressure escalated. A notice arrived suspending her building permit for the installation of a water line, citing unresolved land use conflicts. A delivery of construction supplies she had ordered was mysteriously redirected, with the company insisting that her address did not exist in the system. When she tried to pay her property tax online, the portal rejected her parcel number as invalid. Each incident on its own could have been explained by error, but together they formed a pattern, one that smelled of deliberate interference. At night she began to notice strange signs near the edges of her land. Small piles of stones arranged like markers, branches broken in a way that suggested intention rather than chance, faint tire tracks where no vehicle should have been. She destroyed the piles and tried to dismiss the rest as paranoia, yet the feeling that she was being slowly surrounded would not leave her. The breaking point came when she returned home from a rare trip into town and found a new envelope taped to her door. This one bore no county insignia but was typed in the same clinical format as the fine, warning her that continued obstruction of the historic road could result in legal seizure of the disputed portion of her property. At the bottom, instead of a signature, there was only the printed phrase, "representative of local interest." She felt a cold weight settle in her chest as she read it. Drake had not lied when he said he was not directly involved, but someone, perhaps acting on his behalf, perhaps connected through layers of influence, was moving against her with the confidence of those who believed themselves untouchable. Bethany realized that this was no simple misunderstanding of boundaries. It was the beginning of a calculated attempt to erase her claim entirely, one small step at a time, until she was forced to surrender not because she was wrong, but because she was exhausted, isolated, and without allies. That night she barely slept, her mind replaying every word of the encounter at the gate, every phrase in the letters, every detail that hinted at a design larger than she could yet see. She had chosen this land to escape noise, but now the silence pressed against her like a suffocating force, heavy with unseen eyes and unheard decisions being made elsewhere. By the time dawn broke, she knew that whatever peace she had found here was over. The forest no longer felt like sanctuary but like contested ground, and she understood with a clarity that chilled her more than the morning air. The battle for her home had only just begun, and her neighbor was not simply another landowner, but the opening move in a conflict designed to test how far she was willing to go to defend what was hers. Bethany had always believed that conflicts, even bitter ones, could be handled with documents, with the right signatures and stamps, with the slow but rational processes of law and administration. Yet as the days unfolded, she came to realize that what she was facing was not an argument over paperwork but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to strip her of strength and will. The first real sign of escalation came on a humid morning when she drove to the county clerk's office, determined to file an appeal against the fine, and was told that her file could not be located in the system. The clerk, a thin man with the distracted demeanor of someone long accustomed to stonewalling, looked at her with bland politeness and said that without a record number there was nothing he could do. She produced her copy of the deed, the survey, and the official letter imposing the fine, but he pushed them back toward her across the counter as though they were irrelevant, repeating the same phrase. "If it's not in the system, it doesn't exist." She walked out of the building, shaking, the papers clutched tightly in her hands, realizing that someone had erased her presence from the official narrative. When she returned home, the unease thickened into dread. The fence along the old path had been tampered with. One section pulled loose and lying flat against the ground, as though someone had demonstrated how easily the barrier could be removed. No valuables were stolen, no windows broken, but the message was unmistakable. She repaired the fence that evening, hammering the boards back into place, yet she did so with the awareness that the intrusion was not random vandalism. Whoever had done it wanted her to know that her defenses meant nothing. The next morning, a package arrived at her gate with no return address, inside of which she found nothing but a roll of outdated maps marked with faint pencil lines tracing a road through her property straight to Mallon's estate. There was no note, No explanation, just the silent assertion that these maps held more authority than her deed. She burned them in her fire pit, watching the paper curl into ash, but she could not shake the feeling that destroying the evidence meant nothing to those who had sent it. Over the following weeks, the pressure mounted in subtle but relentless ways. Contractors she had hired to install a rainwater system canceled without explanation, telling her later in hushed voices that they had received warnings about her project. Her bank delayed the processing of a mortgage payment, citing inconsistencies in the property address, and when she called to resolve the issue, the representative sounded almost embarrassed, repeating that the system showed her parcel as under review. Friends from the city who had promised to visit changed their minds at the last minute, citing conflicting schedules, though Bethany suspected that word had reached them about her trouble with the county. Isolation, once a chosen luxury, began to feel like exile. One evening, as the sun sank and shadows stretched long across the clearing, she noticed a drone hovering above her property, its faint hum almost masked by the wind. She waved her arms at it, shouted, even threw a stick into the air, but it merely adjusted its position, observing her silently before disappearing back toward the direction of Mallon's estate. That night she heard noises outside, twigs snapping, a low rumble of engines idling at a distance, and though she forced herself not to look out the window, she lay awake until dawn, her mind tracing every possibility of who might be watching and what they intended. The next morning, a new letter arrived, this one delivered by certified mail, repeating the threat of land seizure if she did not restore access to the alleged road. The sender was again listed only as representative of local interest, but the envelope bore the watermark of an expensive law firm from the city. Bethany's fear sharpened into anger. She contacted a surveyor, a man recommended by one of her remote clients, and paid him to conduct a fresh evaluation of her property boundaries. He spent 2 days walking the land with his instruments, and when he finished, his report confirmed precisely what she already knew. Her land was properly registered, her fence stood entirely within her boundaries, and no public right-of-way had ever been recorded. Yet when she presented this report at the county office, the receptionist refused to accept it, claiming that only documentation from approved partners could be considered. The implication was clear. Certain experts were allowed to speak, others were not, and she had chosen the wrong kind. Desperate for clarity, Bethany searched through archives at the local university library, poring over microfilm and scanned records of land surveys from decades past. There, she discovered something that chilled her. While her land had always been listed as private, the adjacent parcel, the one now owned by Mallon, had once included a notation for provisional access, a vague phrase that appeared in documents from the 1970s but vanished from later records. The access had never been formalized, never recorded as an easement. Yet the fact that it had existed even in rumor provided the seed for Mallon's current claim. He did not need proof. He needed only doubt, and doubt was enough to turn bureaucracy against her. When she confronted him again, this time intercepting him as he returned to his estate, he greeted her with the same calm arrogance, telling her that she was making life more difficult than it had to be. He insisted that the history of the land would always outweigh her temporary paperwork, and suggested once again that if she simply removed her fence, the matter would disappear. She accused him of manipulating the county, of using his influence to erase her records, but he only smiled and said, "The county follows precedent, not sentiment." His tone was not threatening, yet the certainty in his words made her feel as though she were already defeated. The following night, the escalation took a more personal form. She returned from checking the far edge of her property to find the lights in her home flickering. The breaker tripped though she had not overloaded anything. When she opened the electrical box, she found that wires had been deliberately cut and twisted back together with careless hands. Whoever had done it knew how to disable her systems just enough to rattle her without causing irreparable harm. It was a demonstration, a reminder that her home was vulnerable no matter how carefully she tried to guard it. She repaired the damage herself, refusing to call for help. But as she sat in the dim glow of a single lamp that night, she felt the weight of an invisible hand pressing against her life, guiding events toward a conclusion she had not chosen. Bethany understood that the conflict was no longer about a fence or a fine, but about power, the kind of power that operated in shadows and whispered through channels inaccessible to her. She had become the obstacle to someone else's vision of the land, and they were prepared to wear her down piece by piece until she either abandoned her claim or collapsed under the pressure. Yet, as she stared at the documents spread across her desk, the proof of her rightful ownership, she also understood that surrender would mean not just losing her home, but allowing the silence she had fought so hard to find to be rewritten by lies. The first escalation had begun, and though she felt small against the forces arrayed around her, a part of her hardened, preparing for the battles still to come. Bethany's breaking point arrived not with another letter or a confrontation at the fence, but in the form of discovery. One of those moments when scattered pieces suddenly fit together and the picture they reveal is far darker than expected. She had grown tired of being stonewalled by officials and watching her documents dismissed as though they were trivial scribbles, so she decided to chase the roots of the problem from another angle, convinced that buried in the dusty layers of history there had to be something that could not be easily denied. Her evenings became consumed with research. She drove long miles to county archives stored in neglected basements, requested microfilm reels from the state library, and begged for access to private collections kept by the local historical society. At first, the work seemed tedious, endless lines of deeds and property transfers, maps copied and recopied until the ink faded to smudges. But then, almost by accident, she noticed a recurring annotation on maps dated from the late 1960s through the mid-1980s. A thin, dotted line drawn through what was now her property, marked simply as Proposed Roadway Provisional. It was never built, never legalized, but the symbol appeared consistently for nearly 2 decades, as though planners at the time had intended for a connection to exist between what later became Mallon's estate and the highway. Her pulse quickened as she copied the maps and laid them out in sequence, realizing that the road Drake Mallon spoke of was not a ghost trail remembered only by trees and soil, but a bureaucratic phantom that had lingered in drafts and proposals, until it achieved a kind of half-life. It had never been real in practice, but its shadow was present enough for someone determined to twist it into a weapon. She took the copies to a legal aid office in the nearest city, where a young attorney named David Carter agreed to review them. He listened patiently as she explained the escalation of harassment, then leaned back in his chair and said, "This is worse than you think. What Mallon is doing isn't just intimidation. He's exploiting something we call institutional memory. If a road was ever proposed, even abandoned, some officials will treat it as if it still exists, because no one wants to risk liability. He doesn't need proof. He needs to plant the suggestion that your land is obstructing public access, and the system will bend toward him because it is safer to believe him than to investigate." Bethany left his office shaken, carrying not only his warning, but also a strange sense of validation. At last, someone had put words to the nightmare she was trapped in. Yet Carter warned her that winning would not be as simple as presenting the truth, because truth in such matters was rarely decisive. What she needed was counterweight. Evidence strong enough to not just negate Mallon's claim, but to expose the manipulations behind it. He suggested contacting the environmental foundation that had sold her the property, though Bethany admitted she had tried and failed. The foundation had dissolved months after her purchase, its assets absorbed into larger organizations, and emails sent to old addresses bounced back. Carter frowned but advised her to keep digging, because proof of the foundation's final surveys could serve as critical leverage. Fueled by equal parts fear and determination, Bethany spent the following weeks in a haze of travel and correspondence. She visited the last listed office of the foundation, only to find a locked door and a sign for a new tenant, a design firm with no knowledge of the previous occupants. She tracked down former employees through LinkedIn and obscure alumni networks, sending messages that mostly went unanswered. Finally, a retired coordinator named Evelyn Price responded, agreeing to meet at a quiet cafe outside the city. Evelyn was in her 70s, with sharp eyes that suggested decades of bureaucratic navigation had not dulled her instincts. When Bethany explained her situation, Evelyn nodded gravely and admitted that the foundation had faced pressure in its final years from developers who wanted to acquire protected parcels. There were whispers, she said softly, about certain board members making deals under the table. Some lands were sold properly, some were adjusted. We kept meticulous records, but when the foundation was dissolved, boxes of files went missing. Not lost. Missing. Bethany's stomach tightened as Evelyn described how developers sometimes worked with county officials to erase or alter boundaries, quietly aligning paperwork with old proposals to make contested land appear legitimate for construction. If Malin built on your land, Evelyn said, then someone made that possible on paper first. He wouldn't risk it otherwise. She reached into her bag and handed Bethany a faded folder. This is a copy I kept of our final survey for your parcel. It proves that when we sold it to you, there was no easement, no road, nothing. But be careful. If he's gone this far, he has allies. These kinds of people don't play fair driving home with the folder on the passenger seat. Bethany felt both a surge of hope and a creeping dread. She now had proof that her land was clean, but she also understood that possession of such proof made her a threat to powerful interests. That night, as she spread the documents across her table, she noticed something she had overlooked, an annotation in pencil on one map, faint but legible, reading, "Pending adjustment, 2019. The foundation had sold her the land in 2020. Whatever adjustment had been pending, it had not been implemented, and yet it suggested that someone had been preparing to alter her boundaries even before she entered the picture. The revelation gnawed at her. It meant that Malin's construction might not have been impulsive greed, but part of a longer plan, one in which her presence was nothing more than an obstacle. The next day, she hiked along the edge of her property, past the fence and into the woods where the phantom road would have run. There, hidden beneath brush, she found remnants of survey markers, small metal stakes hammered into the soil, some still bearing faded plastic flags. She knelt in the dirt, tracing them with trembling fingers, realizing that someone had indeed mapped a line through her land not years ago but recently. Her anger flared, mingled with fear, because this was no accident of history. It was evidence that Malin, or those working with him, had acted deliberately to resurrect the ghost of a road that never was, intending to carve it through her life whether she consented or not. When she confronted him again, standing on the gravel road that separated their properties, he did not deny it. He smiled thinly and told her that sometimes the future required sacrifices, that individuals could not stand in the way of progress. His words were measured, polite, but beneath them she heard the chilling certainty of someone who believed himself untouchable. He warned her that fighting too hard would only drag her deeper into debt and conflict, while cooperation could make everything disappear. Bethany turned away without replying, gripping Evelyn's folder so tightly that the paper edges cut her skin. She knew then that this was no longer about fines or fences, but about exposing the lie at the heart of Malin's empire. And, though she was terrified, she also felt something shift within her, a resolve that if they wanted a war of endurance, she would not collapse quietly into the shadows of their fabricated maps. Bethany had thought that obtaining Evelyn Price's folder and discovering the buried survey markers was the peak of tension, but in truth it was only the foundation for a far more vicious phase of the conflict. Having confirmed that Malin's claims were manufactured, she expected that presenting her evidence would force officials to back down. Yet, when she brought the folder to the county planning division, the clerk on duty barely glanced at the documents. Before telling her that they could not be accepted, as copies lacked chain of custody and therefore carried no authority. She insisted that the folder came directly from the Foundation's coordinator, but the clerk repeated with mechanical calm that, unless authenticated through approved legal channels, the papers were meaningless. The realization struck her like a blow. The truth existed, but the system had been carefully rigged to recognize only the voices and documents that served Mallon's agenda. That same week, the harassment escalated from bureaucratic obstacles into physical intimidation. One evening, she returned from town to find the wooden posts of her fence marked with streaks of red paint, the kind used for survey lines. The marks extended deep into her property, tracing a diagonal path as though someone had already drawn the outline of a future road. The paint was fresh, still tacky when she touched it, and her stomach turned with the knowledge that whoever had done this had walked her land while she was away, confident that she could do nothing to stop them. She photographed the markings, but when she called the sheriff's office, the deputy who answered dismissed it as a civil dispute and advised her to work it out with your neighbor. That night she barely slept, listening to every creak of the forest, as if it were a footstep, her mind replaying the image of red lines carving through her sanctuary. Days later, the campaign shifted again. Her bank account was frozen temporarily due to address discrepancies, leaving her unable to pay contractors or even buy groceries until hours of calls restored partial access. A letter arrived from the tax assessor informing her that her property value had been recalculated, tripling her tax burden on the grounds of pending roadway adjacency. She laughed bitterly at the absurdity, yet behind the absurdity lay the unmistakable weight of coordination. These were not accidents. Someone was systematically altering her financial landscape to pressure her toward surrender. She considered going public, but the thought of exposing her fragile life to scrutiny from strangers, many of whom might instinctively side with a wealthy, influential neighbor, made her recoil. Silence had been her refuge, and now it was her prison. One evening, while sorting through her correspondence, she noticed an envelope without a postmark. Inside was a printed offer, a purchase contract offering to buy her parcel at double its assessed value. The document was unsigned but carried a notary seal, suggesting that it was ready for execution if she agreed. The message was unmistakable. Walk away quietly and profit, or resist and be destroyed. She burned the contract in her stove, watching the flames consume the paper until only blackened scraps remained, though the smell lingered long after, clinging to her clothes like the stench of compromise. Her defiance, however, provoked retaliation. The following night she awoke to a crashing sound and discovered that one of her windows had been shattered by a rock. Attached to it was a scrap of paper bearing only a crude map of her land, with the supposed road sketched boldly across it. She called the sheriff again, but this time the dispatcher placed her on hold until the line went dead. When she called back, she was told that no deputy was available, and she should secure her property herself. It was in that moment she understood fully that law enforcement would not protect her. Whether through negligence, intimidation, or complicity, they had abandoned her to fight alone. Despite the growing pressure, she refused to yield. She returned to the library and requested more archives, digging into records not just of her land but of Mallon's estate. What she uncovered confirmed Evelyn's warnings. The permits for his construction had been rushed through with unusual speed, signed off by the same official who now rejected her documents. Financial disclosures revealed that the contractor who built his mansion had ties to the county board. The pattern was undeniable. Mallon had not simply manipulated the system. He had been its beneficiary for years, using influence and money to erase obstacles until her arrival disrupted the script. The final escalation of this phase arrived one stormy evening when she heard engines on the gravel road and saw headlights illuminating the trees. 3 vehicles stopped near her gate, their occupants stepping out briefly before driving away. In the morning, she discovered why. Pinned to the gate post was a laminated notice declaring her property under provisional review for public access corridor designation. It bore an official seal, but the typography was inconsistent, the wording clumsy. Whether authentic or forged, it had the same effect. An announcement to anyone passing that her ownership was contested, fragile, perhaps already lost. She tore it down, but she knew others had seen it. She could already imagine the whispers in town, neighbors convinced that she was squatting on land destined for development. Sitting alone in her house with the storm raging outside, Bethany felt the weight of the escalation pressing down. The harassment was no longer subtle. It was open, relentless, and designed to break her spirit. Yet as she stared at Evelyn's folder and the copies of the surveys she had gathered, she also recognized that Malin's strategy carried its own weakness. The more he pushed, the clearer his desperation became. If she could gather enough indisputable evidence and find the right channel to present it, she might not only defend her land, but expose the machinery he relied on. The question was how long she could endure before the campaign stripped her of everything she had fought to build. The second escalation had transformed her conflict into war, and she knew there would be no retreat, only survival or erasure. The storm that had lingered on the horizon for months finally broke. Not with lightning in the sky, but with the sudden collision of truths that could no longer be denied or suppressed. Bethany had reached the end of her patience with waiting, with watching her world be rewritten by the lies of men who believed themselves immune to consequence, and she chose to strike back not with anger but with precision. She gathered every scrap of evidence she had collected, the folder from Evelyn, the copies of old maps showing the Phantom Road as nothing more than a provisional dream, the recent survey that proved her boundaries intact, and the photos of red paint slashing across her land. She packaged them carefully, creating not one but several identical binders, and sent them by certified mail not only to the county board but also to the state land office, the regional department of transportation, and even the state auditor. For the first time, she felt as though she had shifted the weight of silence, no longer clutching her proof like a secret, but throwing it into arenas where erasure would not be so simple. The retaliation came swiftly. Within days, she was summoned to a county hearing, scheduled with little notice, where Malin himself appeared with a team of lawyers in sharp suits, their confidence radiating as though the outcome were already guaranteed. The room was small, paneled in cheap wood, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, but to Bethany it felt like a stage on which her life would be decided. Malin's lawyers presented glossy maps, notarized statements, and photographs of the old footpath, speaking with the Polish of men accustomed to bending officials to their will. They spoke of historic precedent, of community access, of responsible development, framing her resistance as selfish obstruction. When Bethany rose to speak, her voice trembled at first, but she steadied it with the knowledge that she was not inventing stories, but presenting facts. She laid out her documents one by one, explaining how the road had never been real, how her land had been sold without easement, how recent survey markers had been planted to fabricate a narrative. For a moment she thought her words would vanish into the void of indifference, but then something unexpected happened. One of the board members, an older man with weathered hands who had sat silently through most of the proceedings, leaned forward and asked Malin's lawyers why their maps contained annotations identical to those in the 1970s drafts she had unearthed. "If this road is active," he said, "why does your document look like a photocopy of a plan that was never approved?" The lawyers stammered, and Malin's expression flickered with irritation, the first crack in his mask of calm authority. Bethany seized the moment, producing Evelyn's survey and pointing to the pencil note marked, "Pending Adjustment, 2019, demanding to know who had intended to alter the boundaries before her purchase and why the adjustment had never been disclosed. The room shifted then, the atmosphere no longer complacent, but tense, as though the officials realized they were standing on ground less stable than they had believed. The climax unfolded not in shouts or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet collapse of certainty. Malin attempted to interject, dismissing her claims as speculation, but the board pressed him with questions about his permits, his contractor's ties, and the timing of his construction. Each answer he offered sounded thinner, less convincing, until finally the chair of the board announced that the matter could not be resolved on the evidence provided and would be referred to the state auditor for investigation. Mallon's jaw tightened, his lawyers whispering urgently at his side, but the decision was final. Bethany walked out of the room with her legs shaking, the binders still clutched in her arms, but for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt the balance tilt ever so slightly in her favor. That evening, as she returned to her home, she saw Mallon standing at the edge of his property, his silhouette framed against the fading light. He did not speak, did not raise his voice, but his stare carried the weight of unfinished business. Bethany met his gaze without flinching, understanding that the war was not over, but also knowing that he had been forced into the light, his schemes no longer hidden behind the opaque machinery of bureaucracy. The climax was not victory, not yet, but it was survival, and survival was enough to prove that she could stand against him without breaking. The weeks that followed the hearing carried a strange stillness, as if the storm had shifted to a distance, rumbling but not yet breaking again. Bethany received confirmation that the state auditor had accepted the case, and though she knew investigations could drag on for months, even years, the acknowledgement alone felt like a shield. Letters demanding payment ceased. The county office no longer rejected her tax filings, and her property number was restored in the digital systems that had previously erased her. The silence that settled around her was not the same as before, no longer purely peaceful but weighted with the knowledge of battles fought, but it was hers again, and she clung to it with a kind of reverence. Mallon's estate remained lit at night, his vehicles still moved along the gravel road, but he did not approach her gate, and she did not see his lawyers in town. He had retreated into his walls, waiting perhaps for another chance, but his certainty had been fractured, and that fracture was enough to grant her space to breathe. Bethany repaired the broken window, repainted the posts that had been scarred with red lines, and walked the perimeter of her land with deliberate slowness, touching the trees as though reaffirming their allegiance. She knew the fight was not truly over, that Mallon still possessed influence and resources far greater than hers, but she had exposed his tactics, and exposure was something men like him feared more than confrontation. At night she sat on her porch and listened to the forest without flinching at every sound, the weight of dread replaced by a quieter vigilance. Survival had reshaped her, carving away the last illusions of safety, but also revealing a resilience she had not known she carried. Her home was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a statement, proof that even when power sought to erase her, she could stand and remain.